From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. Generations of Singapore students will remember going on learning journeys to the Kranji War Memorial. But few of us know why it's in Kranji in the first place, or how its design came about. Today, we speak to Athanasios Tsakonas, an Australian architect, who has researched the history of Kranji War Memorial's construction and its perception by various groups in Singapore and abroad. Okay, thanks very much, Athanasios, for joining us today. To start off, why did you decide to investigate the history of the Kranji War Cemetery?
Thanks, Dev, for having me. Glad to be here. I think my interest in Kranji actually started in 1992 when I was just a young architect and was tasked to a project up in the north of Singapore, and I came across it. And it really surprised me that there was this elegant structure on top of a hill just floating above a series of war graves. But there was very little information on its design. And you've got to remember that in 1992, there wasn't really an internet or mobile phones or anything of that sort. And I have to admit, I was quite young, only recently graduated, and I was pretty ignorant of the war in Asia in general and in Singapore in specific. And it took a while for me to better understand that. But they had a ledger of the cemetery and a little brief history that goes into the records room. And it did identify that the architect was Colin St Clair Oakes. So I found myself, because I was living in Singapore, I found myself every few years or so visiting Kranji. But it was only about 2016 at another visit that I discovered that there was still very little known about the architect and the memorial itself. So it sort of, it posed me a few questions as to how can such a significant sacred structure in this modern city-state, with all the technology and all the information at your fingertips by then, and they didn't know any more about this structure. And why was the architect not known either? But I had realized at the time that local writers were looking at Kranji, but they were looking at it through the history of its inhabitants, the politics of its founding. Others were looking at Kranji through their particular fields of research, be it social geography, military history, etc. Even the War Graves Commission were producing booklets and they mentioned Kranji, but it was always through the view of, well, this is in Singapore, this is one of our Asian sites. It wasn't anything more than that. And I realized that nobody actually knew the history of the structure itself, how it was designed, who was this designer, and why was it designed? Why was it in Singapore? And who built it, etc. And I found this lack of information quite problematic. And I was quite curious, I must admit. So I decided then that I would explore it a little bit, because I had a bit of time, and write an essay on what I found. So after some investigating, which was pretty difficult, I was fortunate enough to locate the son of Oakes in the UK. And from some of our early conversations, I realized this actually was a much bigger topic. So then I decided I'll go on a research trip to the UK and then met the rest of the Oakes children and took the opportunity to access the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's archives in Maidenhead. I also went to Italy and visited the archives of the British School at Rome, where Oakes lived and studied for 2 years on a Rome scholarship in the early 1930s. It was actually here that really triggered my determination to turn the research into a book, and I'll explain why. In the British School of Rome, they have files on all their former scholars. And in the file on Oakes that I had asked, on the front page, there was a small local British newspaper clipping that had been cut. It was of his obituary. And it sort of struck me that someone at the school had taken the effort to keep track of this student and cut and paste this into his folder, which hit me that as a former student, he was actually important. He was remembered to them. And I felt, coming from an architectural background myself and understanding how most architects never get recognized for anything, that he shouldn't go unrecognized for his body of work, including what he did working for the War Graves Commission. So that's how I decided I'm going to write something about this.
The institution that has overseen the design, construction, and maintenance of the cemetery is called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, or previously known as the Imperial War Graves Commission. What did this commission set out to do in Asia after the Second World War?
Well, from its founding in 1917, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had been responsible for the design, construction, and maintenance of war cemeteries throughout its home base of the UK, Europe, North and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. Asia, on the other hand, was an entirely new proposition, and the sheer scale and distance of the Asian theatre of the war was quite daunting to them. This comes across through the many minutes of meetings that the Commission undertook during the Second World War, which I had access to. And they were trying to anticipate the scope of their work in Asia. And we have to remember that up until as late as August 1945, until the atomic blasts in Japan, there was no real end in sight for the war in Asia, and no real way of being able to plan the work ahead in that extent. So what came across from the minutes was that the Commission needed to consider Asia quite differently from its standard practice. And this involved not only finding people familiar with Asia, but also setting up an organization structure for the management of their operations throughout the region, because they will end up having to maintain these sites in perpetuity thereafter. They were fortunate, though, that the Australian War Graves Service, under the control of the Australian Army at the time, were already quite active throughout those parts of Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific, which had already been liberated by Australian and American forces. So they had already a team on the ground that could represent them and give them advice and give them direction about how to organize themselves in this region. At the same time, a substantial number of the casualties that they were going to consolidate in permanent war cemeteries and commemorate with memorials were prisoners of war of the Japanese, unlike what they encountered in Europe, so to speak. So it was having to think about it in an entirely different way. In the case of the war cemeteries and memorials in Asia, the distinct difference from the conventional approach as seen in Europe, for example, is that they were designed by an architect who had distinctive modernist tendencies. And this is one of the key points of difference that distinguish the Asian effort with those in Europe, for example. At the same time, the architects of the Australian War Graves Service, which had by 1946 become the Anzac agency of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, they were also modernists, and most of whom had also recently served in the war. And they were creating sites in the other parts of Asia reflecting their own design tendencies. And I think architecturally, this links most of the Asian sites to one another, which is quite important to architectural historians, the narrative of modernism through these sites of commemoration.
Now, you mentioned earlier the architect of the Kranji War Cemetery, Colin St Clair Oakes. Why is he significant to understanding the cemetery's design?
Oakes was the driving force in designing the significant war cemeteries throughout Asia. His design methodology allowed the site to often dictate the layout, with the monuments sitting comfortably within this. It was a fresh approach and offered a contemporary view of the traditional war cemetery. And because he himself had only recently been serving in Burma, I believe his understanding of the conflict as a modern war, one in which tradition has to take a back seat, is reflected in his work through the distinct lack of decorative motifs or adornments. Oakes himself is a very interesting architect. Firstly, unlike the other principal architects of the Commonwealth War Graves, he comes from a middle-class background. He's not someone from privilege or from the establishment. His father had served on the Western Front and lived to actually return. After finishing his initial studies at a polytechnic, he travelled to Finland and worked in the office of Jarl Eklund who was a protege of Eliel Saarinen and who would in turn train a young Eero Saarinen, who most people would recognize as a very significant modern architect in the US. Oakes then wins a Rome scholarship, which sends him to Italy for 2 years, where he obtains a grounding in classical architecture, but it's actually where his modernist tendencies emerge in a small house commission and some other design projects that he does. He then returns to the UK, joins the Architectural Association, by then the country's first modernist school, and he teaches part-time whilst working alongside modernist architects such as Robert Furneaux Jordan and Maxwell Allen, and finally takes up a position in Bengal as assistant architect to the government, undertaking numerous public works, pretty much all reinforcing his modernist ideals. In the case of Kranji, the Kranji Memorial, which was initially conceived as a memorial for the air forces of the Commonwealth, he took his design cues from the silhouettes of planes handed out to servicemen to identify friend from foe. And then he chose the silhouette of the Hawker Hurricane, which he came to see as a savior during the battles in Burma, as he recounted to his son, lying on the ground, taking cover, and watching these planes overhead, giving them protection. This wing outline becomes the floating form we see today at Kranji. And under the wing, protected as it was, are the thousands of missing servicemen.
Now, regarding Allied prisoners of war during the Japanese occupation in Singapore, the first place that comes to mind is Changi Prison. Now, why did Changi not end up being the location of the war cemetery, and why was Kranji selected in the end?
The non-selection of Changi is actually an interesting story. Changi was, in fact, one of 7 sites considered for Singapore, but it actually comprised 2 sites. The main Changi Prisoner of War Cemetery, which was situated somewhere between Selarang and Roberts Barracks, and then there was a separate British Prisoner of War Cemetery further south along the coast at Wing Lung, on the site of a former Boy Scout camp. The others that were to be considered included the Dover Road Military Cemetery at Pasir Panjang, which historians of history would recognize as the place of the last major battle before the fall of Singapore. Then there was the small hospital cemetery at the former mental hospital and leper settlement, which is in a place the British called Melake. There was also an interesting burial ground in Nee Sun, adjacent the Kampong Pengkalan Petai, on the banks of the Sungai Selita, just southwest of Selita Airfield. There was also Point 348, otherwise known as Bukit Batok Hill. And of course, Kranji itself, which was just a small cemetery set up for the hospital and prisoner of war camp that had been set up there in the middle of 1944. So what happened was that in January 1946, Oakes arrived in Singapore with 2 colleagues, Colonel Harry Obard, the Commission's Inspector for Burma and India, and Major Andrew McFarlane, the Commission's Deputy Director of Works, and they all had instructions to select one of these sites. Changi was the ideal site for them and was heavily promoted by the Australian government, given the public sentiment back home on the treatment of its thousands of prisoners of war. It was a very raw topic. But the Royal Air Force was rapidly pushing on expanding the runways to a very small airfield that the Japanese had actually commenced during the war using prisoner of war labour. And given the need for the longer runways for larger aircraft to service the newly liberated Singapore, they had to rule Changi out. Today, that's the site of Changi Airport. Most of the other sites, whilst offering some positive aspects, had to be ruled out because of their poor soil conditions, limited access, and then there were difficulties in obtaining land tenure. But Point 348, or Bukit Batok Hill, was different, and it was actually the preferred site for not only Oakes, but also Obard and the Australian head of their war grave service, Brigadier Athol Brown, who was there also. It had everything that Oakes was looking for and offered a really impressive aspect, given that it was on top of Singapore's second tallest hill. And if you examine Oakes' designs for Sai Wan War Cemetery in Hong Kong and Kohima War Cemetery in northeast India, you will get an idea of how he intended to design it, with the graves working their ways along a stepped terracing down from the top of the hill. They lodged 0.348 as their preferred site to the commission. That went officially in. But the problem they faced with this site was political. It wasn't physical. It had been the site of the Japanese memorial to their war dead, the Sainon Churieto, and even hosted a smaller memorial in the shape of a cross for the Commonwealth allies. Both, though, had been demolished by the British forces after reoccupying Singapore. And I guess the politics and symbolism of using the former enemy's memorial ground was just too difficult for the commission to accept, which left basically Kranji as the preferred site. And what I was hoping to convey in this is that what's interesting about this is that a similar situation arose almost at the same time in Yokohama, where a Japanese memorial to their own war dead was located in what was to become the Yokohama War Cemetery. And whilst this monument was also demolished, the Australian War Graves Service, who were designing that cemetery, retained the location and built the military cemetery on top of it.
What were some of the considerations and challenges in designing and building the Kranji Memorial? And who built it?
The biggest challenge in developing Kranji actually was time. Its original layout was conceived in 1946 during Oakes' first trip, but he was only able to begin designing Kranji in 1953, and of course it was then completed in 1957, 12 years after the end of the war. This had a lot to do with political priorities, with the demand for India's war cemeteries to be developed first. But during this period, Kranji's layout was often altered because of the discovery of more casualties. In particular, the many mass graves discovered in Siglap and Bedok in 1951. Then there were the graves of Dutch and British servicemen brought in from Saigon in 1954 because of the instability there. In fact, a few years earlier in 1948, a number of Dutch war graves already in Kranji had to be exhumed and transferred to Indonesia on the request of Dutch authorities. So there was always this changing of the layout, and it wasn't one or two. We're talking about hundreds of people who were being reinterred to Kranji. There was also the decision, quite late, to include thousands of missing army personnel from the Malayan campaign within the Kranji Memorial because the commission found itself running out of time and decided to consolidate rather than create another memorial elsewhere. And even after Oakes' design had been completed, it had to face the scrutiny of traditionalists who were a touch concerned about its modern look. And this comes across in the minutes. And the fact that he was requested to physically scale down the memorial by 10% for cost-cutting purposes. And I want to point out that this wasn't done to similar monuments in the UK. By way of comparison, the construction, on the other hand, progressed smoothly, and this had a lot to do with the appointed contractor, Ho Bok Ki. Ho Bok Ki's story is quite fascinating and one of the most satisfying discoveries. In the archive files on Kranji at the War Graves Commission, his name appeared only a single time. I then got help from a researcher at the National Library Board who found his name in Chinese character, and that in turn enabled me to locate a whole source of information on him and Kranji through the Chinese language sources. Ho Bok Ki comes from the small town of Hui'an in Fujian, China. Hui'an is the stone cutting and carving center of China, reputed for their headstones and temple sculptures, which are exported throughout the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. He arrived in Singapore in 1929 as a qualified carpenter and got work as a subcontractor on army camps and other such military structures before the war. During the war, he kept his head down and slipped in and out of Malaya to avoid the Japanese purges of local Chinese. After the war, he went back to repairing and rebuilding many of the same former army camps and bases before expanding into larger public institutions. And whilst Kranji was his most prominent project, he was also responsible for building the much-loved former National Library at Stamford Road, the Nian Kongsi School at Balestier Road, the Singapore Broadcasting Centre at Caldecott Hill, and the Mount Vernon Crematorium, amongst others. With Kranji, I tend to believe the reputation of the Hui'an builders in stonemasonry might have helped him in securing this project. Singapore's original war memorial, the cenotaph at the Esplanade, designed after the one at Whitehall in the UK, was also built by a Huiyan migrant, So Ma Eng. And on a side note, the contribution of Huiyan contractors in Singapore is quite significant. And from the research, I was able to write another dedicated essay specifically on them for BiblioAsia, which is well worth having a look at. As to Kranji's construction, on the day of the unveiling, Ho Bok Ki placed an advertorial in the local Nanyang Xiangpao Chinese newspaper in which he proudly highlights the reinforced concrete slab roof of the memorial, which was still quite novel back then in 1957, and the use of Shanghai render. To clarify, Shanghai render or plaster is a kind of granolithic cement render that emerged from Hong Kong in the mid-1920s and became one of the most popular choices for modern buildings in Asia. It is also tied closely to the construction culture and movement of Cantonese craftsmen throughout the overseas Chinese networks. So throughout Kranji, those walls that you see that are not clad in the traditional Portland stone from the UK are in fact finished with this Shanghai render. Oakes also used this finish on the Sia 1 memorial in Hong Kong.
Now, taking a detour, few people realize that there's a Singapore State Cemetery right beside the Kranji War Cemetery. Could you explain how this came about?
The Singapore State Cemetery came about through the Singapore government's sudden realization that Singapore's first president, Yusof Ishak, was in poor health and his possible death was imminent. This was because he suffered a serious heart condition whilst on a tour in Australia in April 1968 and was hospitalised in Melbourne. The government also realised this was going to be the first death of a state figure after independence and that there was urgency in finding a suitable location for a cemetery. And this was also a very sensitive matter, and the development of the state cemetery was placed under the direct oversight of the Prime Minister's office, which was Lee Kuan Yew at the time. The first task of the Prime Minister's office was to second Arthur Alfonso, the director of the Botanic Gardens, and Tan Beng Kiat, the senior architect heading up the Special Duties Department at the Public Works Department. Alfonso and Tan soon identified a plot of land that had been granted to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for the development of Kranji, but appeared to now be surplus to their needs. And because of the solemnity and dignity that Kranji provided, they felt this was the correct location. The Botanic Gardens was then tasked with making the approach to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to return this piece of land they identified back to the state. And this in itself was a very complicated issue because the land originally allocated to the commission was given in perpetuity. It took over a year for the land to be officially returned, and Yusof Ishak died less than a month later. So whilst the legalities were being sorted, Tan Beng Kiat had commenced designing the state cemetery. Tan himself was a modernist architect and is credited as designing Singapore's National Stadium and the International Airport at Paya Lebar. But in the case of the state cemetery, his one significant architectural gesture is the giant white archway that frames the entrance to both the state cemetery and obviously now to Kranji War Cemetery beyond. This archway is 40 feet or 12.2 meters tall, and it really has divided opinion to its design merits amongst the local architectural community. The most pressing challenge, or the most pressing technical challenge in creating the state cemetery was in fact finding water to ensure the turfing was at least green and presentable. And this was on account of the drought affecting Singapore since 1963 and the severe water rationing measures that had seen people being prosecuted for using potable water for non-critical activities. Even the war cemetery had no piped-in water supply for its own. It was actually the Singapore Intelligence Services, in an operation cloaked in secrecy, that managed to procure 2 water meters and piping using the water board as agents, one of which was for the war cemetery. And yet, after all this effort, the state cemetery only has 2 inhabitants, Yusof Ishak and the second president, Benjamin Shears. Devon Nair, the third president, died in Canada and was interned there. Wee Kim Wee, the fourth president, requested his ashes be placed in Mandai Crematorium, And this was an important break with tradition and the social stratification such a cemetery presented, given that modern Singapore was attempting meritocracy. But at the same time, it creates this anomaly. You create a state cemetery and no one wishes to be buried there. Even Lee Kuan Yew's ashes were interred at Mandai. Interestingly, this dilemma will come to a head in the coming years. The current president, Halima Yacob, is Muslim, and in her faith, burial is required.
Now, Kranji War Cemetery survives as a reminder of colonial-era suffering and sacrifice. How do memories of this cemetery differ in Singapore compared to other Commonwealth states like Britain and Australia?
This is actually a difficult question, and my simplest way of responding to it is that Kranji is seen in different ways and has different meanings to all those states, in particular Singapore. Even amongst the Commonwealth nations, as you've just mentioned, Britain and Australia, its perception differs considerably. For example, the British obviously view Kranji through the prism of their former empire throughout Asia and the many other sites in which they fought and are commemorated. This includes the hundreds of sites in Europe during the Second World War and the First World War for that matter. Now, whilst Kranji strongly reflects their period ruling Singapore, I've noticed that in the last few years there has been a growing emphasis towards presenting the Rangoon Memorial, which is located in Tok Yan War Cemetery in Yangon, Burma. Again, that cemetery was designed by Oakes, as the main site for them in Asia. And I've been wondering about this, whether or not this is on account of the growing interest in Britain's Burma campaign, which ended in a victory, as opposed to Singapore, which was the site of their greatest capitulation. Australia, on the other hand, sees Kranji in a different light, and this has a lot to do with Singapore's reputation as a traumatic site of incarceration of its many servicemen and its public's resentment towards the British military in creating this condition. This is compounded by Australia's earlier experiences in the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in the First World War, again under the command of the British. And it also reflects the deeper question of Australia's military relationship with the UK and its further embrace of the US as an ally and saviour during the war and thereafter. And then there's India, who has over 12,000 of its servicemen commemorated on the Kranji Memorial walls. And yet, apart from its diplomats attending the annual Remembrance Sunday service, its ambivalence to Kranji is obvious through its lack of any further engagement. Maybe this reveals the conflicted position India had in providing its servicemen to the Commonwealth cause, but at the same time also contributing to the INA. Singapore's views on Kranji are also quite complicated and reflect the various tensions of its post-colonial history. Kranji was, after all, unveiled in 1957, 2 years before Singapore achieved self-governance from Britain, and 7 years before becoming an independent republic. And whilst Kranji appears as this foreign imperial project for the majority of its citizens, at the same time, there has been a growing awareness of its importance to its history and identity, which tended to start from the late 1980s onwards. I identified this through Brenda Yeo and Hamza Muzaimi's book, Contested Memoryscapes, which captured this perfectly. It also serves to instill the ideas of national sovereignty and sacrifice to nation amongst its national servicemen. But Kranji also offers another possible memory for Singapore, one in which I discussed recently in a public talk to the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, and hopefully engages a younger and more heritage-orientated audience. Kranji is ultimately the amalgamation of many of Singapore's wartime burial grounds and cemeteries, but it is also now a reminder of the many cemeteries that have since disappeared for redevelopment, many of which provided their dead for reburial at Kranji, and also the Kranji Military Cemetery. And for a country like Singapore, which has greatly expanded its population post-war, and most of whom now have no connection to that part of Singapore's history, hopefully Kranji provides a lasting testimony to this difficult past.